Federal government orders deployment of food and relief items to victims of Maiduguri IDP camp fire.
Police rescue 8 kidnapped victims from bandits in Katsina.
They were on their way into the forest through Ankara local government area of the state.
NDLEA intercepts $4.7 million of fake currency in Abuja.
And on Good Morning Nigeria today, we shall discuss the GDP growth for 2021.
Nigeria recorded an annual gross domestic product GDP growth of 3.4% in fourth quarter of last year, that is in 2021, which represents the strongest growth in 7 years since 2014 and the first annual growth since the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020.
The National Bureau of Statistics, that's to say the NBS, in a report last week indicated that Nigeria's GDP grew by 3.98%. That's year on year in real terms for 2021. Now showing a sustained positive growth for 5 quarters since the COVID-19 induced recession witnessed in 2020 when output contracted.
The NBS attributed the strong GDP growth recorded in fourth quarter of 2021 to relative growth in the non-oil sector, which contributed 92.76% of the GDP, basically from agriculture, trade, telecommunication, and financial and insurance subsectors.
For better clarity, the Nigerian economy has been classified broadly into the oil and non-oil sectors. Now, the oil sector, according to the Bureau of Statistics, contracted for the second year running with a steady decline in average crude oil production to just 1.5 million barrels per day. And this was, of course, in the fourth quarter of last year, as against 2.07 million barrels per day recorded in the first quarter of year 2020.
And no doubt, like other sectors, the COVID-19 pandemic took a huge toll on the oil sector, which is still struggling towards recovery, with the international oil prices still hovering well below $100 per barrel.
Well, even hovering below $100 per barrel is a significant climb from the figures that we had witnessed in recent years. But remarkably, Nigeria's overall 3.4% annual GDP growth surpassed what the World Bank and the IMF 2021 economic growth projections had indicated. The World Bank indicated that it would be 2.5%, and the IMF projected 2.7% growth for the country.
And positive development and outlook for the Nigerian economy, we can only wish the growth trajectory is sustained and accelerated as the world gets over the initial tremors of the COVID-19 pandemic. The question to ask now will be, how does this growth affect Nigerians or translate to better living conditions for Nigerians?
That's right. Very pertinent question that you have raised there. Namely, how inclusive and impactful is this growth? And of course, we'll get experts to indicate what the issues are in terms of the numbers and how sustainable the growth trajectory is, and what are the sectors that are the primary drivers, and how can they be further encouraged in terms of the output to ensure that the economy scales up by way of diversification.
And we shall take on these issues and more with our guest on Good Morning Nigeria today. But you're welcome to the program. I am Jumai Yusuf.
And I'm Kingsley Osadolo. I join my colleague Jumai to also welcome you to today's edition of the program. On the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority, we're broadcasting live from our Abuja headquarters studios. A fairly hazy morning here in Nigeria's lovely capital.
Quite easy.
Right now, here is Ifeoma Ojinta, who has the highlights of the morning news. Good morning, Ifeoma.
Good morning, Kingsley and Jumai. Here is the morning news. Governor Gboyega Oyetola has been declared winner of the All Progressives Congress governorship election primary in Osun State. Announcing the result at the party's secretariat in Osogbo, the chairman of the election committee and Kwara State Governor, Abdurrahman Abdurrazak said Governor Oyetola polled 222,169 out of the 235,550 votes cast.
I, Abdurrahman Abdurrazak, Chairman, Primary Election Committee, hereby certify that Adegboyega Isiaka Oyetola, having secured the highest number of votes cast in the Osun governorship primary elections, is hereby declared winner.
Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, Disaster Management and Social Development has directed immediate delivery of food and non-food items to victims of the Mona El Badawi IDP camp in Maiduguri, saying government is intensifying efforts to educate IDPs on how to avert fire incidents. This followed a fire incident on Saturday which raised over 3,000 shelters in the camp. In a statement, the minister expressed sadness at the incident which rendered over 3,000 households homeless. According to her, the disaster has rendered many more people without shelter, even as government intensify efforts to resettle internally displaced persons. Katsina State Police Command has neutralized 2 suspected bandits and rescued 8 kidnapped victims after a gun battle at a village in Malum Fashi local government area of Katsina State. Addressing newsmen on the development, the command's public relations officer, Superintendent of Police, Gambo Isa, says 4 of the rescued victims are nursing mothers.
They were on their way into the forest through Kankara local government area of the state. DPO Kankara was quickly alerted and detailed to block the hoodlums. He succeeded in doing that.
Operatives of the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, NDLEA, has filed an attempt by a syndicate to push fake $4.7 million cash into the Nigerian economy. This followed the interception of a consignment at the Abuja area of the FCT on the 18th of February 2022, earlier sent from Lagos to Abuja. However, a 52-year-old suspect was arrested in connection with the seized parcel, and both the cash and suspects in custody to be transferred to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, for further investigation. 9 people have been confirmed dead in a ghastly motor accident involving a Toyota Hiace bus and a Corolla sports car along Airport Road in Ilorin on Sunday. The Toyota Hiace bus was carrying fuel which ignited the moment the accident occurred.
To preach at least to people for the need for them to actually realize that overspeeding will not take us to anywhere.
And that's the news for now. Good Morning Nigeria continues with Kingsley and Jumai after this break.
You're watching Good Morning Nigeria on Africa's largest TV network, the NTA. It's now time for business news with Comfort Ahmadu.
Nigeria has comparative advantage in production of various agricultural produce, and the Central Bank of Nigeria, through its policies and programs, is continuously strategizing on ways to reduce the country's reliance on oil exports, as well as address the shock in the financial services sector. The Apex Bank, in its effort to promote non-oil export, indicated its plan to discontinue the sale of forex to deposit money banks at the end of the year to enable the banks source forex from the export proceeds. The step experts describe as strategic and apt.
How will they chase it? Is by funding the non-oil export sector, funding the agricultural sector, funding producers of exportable products, funding exporters who are also exporting some of these primary products. Then the bankers now will also have to develop the capacity to understand the basics of export business and operation.
Oil is selling at a very ridiculous price at this point in time. There has to be a direct focus or refocusing of the economy from oil to manufacturing, and if you must do that, there has to be your raw material supply strategy has to be watertight. It has to be properly aligned with the industrial revolution.
The CBN's RT200 program is focused on value-adding export facility, non-oil commodities expansion facility, dedicated non-oil export terminal, and biannual non-oil export summit. With Business News, Comfort Amodu.
Thank you very much, Comfort, for the business package on Good Morning Nigeria. Coming up next is Newspaper Review.
And our newspaper reviewer, Bayo Tovi, is in the studio. Good morning, Bayo.
Good morning. Good morning, Kinsley.
Hi,
Good morning, Nigeria.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Hope you had a pleasant weekend.
Yes, a very relaxing
dust
one.
and the haze. And
Okay. All right. Let's take a look at the front pages of the three papers we have this morning. The Punch and the Nation, their front pages are a bit compressed because they have two adverts on the front pages that are stripped. Let's begin with the Punch. An earpiece there beside the name flags, fuel scarcity, private depots hike rates, more filling stations may sell above 180 naira per litre. Federal government admits inspection failure caused dirty fuel imports and prices soar in states. The lead story says convention, APC battles consensus crisis as Buhari and governors meet Tuesday. State chapters confirm readiness, await Buni's signal, and chairmanship aspirant laments planned postponement. Strike. ASU NEC converges on Abuja today to meet federal government. Pomo treated with industrial chemicals, dangerous. NAFDAC warns Nigerians and probes merchants. As a shipment of Pomo treated with industrial chemicals said to have been imported into the country, and NAFDAC is warning Nigerians and while probing the merchants of the hazardous Pomo. Suspected headers killed 3 mourners in Benue. Troops rescue 8 kidnapped victims. And you can see there, pupils of a primary school in Gombe State. It was on Friday. Whatever the conditions, they are willing and ready to learn. Kwankwanso and I are modern Kano architects. That's according to Ganduje. And pregnant woman, 8 others die on Lagos-bound bus as car and bus collide and explode. Nursing mother on bail for illicit drug, rearrested with tramadol and others. Very quickly, Juma, let me also take a look at the Nation newspaper. Above the name flag, we'll take the following headlines. How Oyetola trounced Aregbeshola's man. Governor extends olive branch. Alaafin seeks support for Tinubu's presidential bid. Kwankwanso, myself, architects of modern Kano. IPPIS not suitable for varsity system, says JAM registrar. Why IMF won't channel $100 billion loan through African Development Bank, and that's by the president. Silver, inspection failure to blame for toxic petrol import. TUC threatens to call out workers over scarcity. And then you have fare hike, fear of passenger drop grips airlines. That's on page 6. NDLEA intercepts fake $4.7 million cash in Abuja, and troops free 8 in Benue.
Let's get the leadership newspaper above the masthead, just like Kinsley read. Kano APC Ganduje pacifies Shekaro and his supporters. You find details on page 11. Top ISWAP commander, 21 orders killed in airstrike. Details on page 9. And just below the masthead, several vehicles trapped at Lagos port over VIN policy. find the details on page. That's due to a vehicle identification number. You find the details on page 7. And the headlines in the leadership newspaper. 5 days to go. PMB, APC governors tackle crucial decision on convention tomorrow. With riders, aspirants, stakeholders kick against governor's anointed chairmanship candidate. Insist on open contest, lament uncertainty of February 26 convention date. 2023, I am ready to get dirty with anyone. Tinubu warns. You find details on page 8. Humanitarian crisis looms in Niger over upsurge in IDPs. That's on page 7. Ohaneze condemns Abuja cattle market killings. You find that on page 6. Bio.
Well, let's start with the results coming from Osun State. The governorship primary was held on Saturday, and the incumbent governor, Gboyega Oyetola, emerged the winner. The chairman of the APC governorship primary, Governor Abdurrahman Abdulrazak, announced that Oyetola pulled 222,169 votes to beat 2 other contestants. Moshood Adioti pulled 12,921 votes, while Lasson Yusuf, former Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives, pulled 460 votes. Governor Abdulrazak commended all the aspirants and party leaders for working for peace. In his speech, acceptance speech, Governor Gboyega Oyetola extended a hand of fellowship to the other 2 aspirants, and he says, "We are all winners." He added, "We are brothers. Let us join hands to build Osun of our dreams." He thanked all the citizens of Osun for standing by him and promising not to let them down in the years ahead. The Nigerian Meteorological Agency, NIMET, has given serious warning and also advised about rainfall predictions for the year. It warned that hazy atmosphere will be cloud a larger part of the country. In fact, this morning, visibility is as poor as about 150 to 200 meters, and therefore, if you are driving, you need to be exceptionally careful. It is going to be unlikely to be worse in areas on the fringes of the Sahara Desert, especially around Maiduguri, Sokoto, and the Adamawa area. Meanwhile, the Director General of the NIMET, Professor Mansour Batazu, says that I advise farmers to be very careful about planting.
I'm sorry to jump in here. We actually had a conversation around the seasonal climate predictions last week.
Okay.
NIMET was here, NISA, which is a hydrological services agency, was also here, along, of course, with another expert. So the details they provided, I believe, are useful. Maybe you may wish to discuss the issues around politics and what happened in Osun. If you recall, we had indicated here that there seemed to have been a lot of hot air around the primaries. And by the way, those primaries that were conducted in Osun over the weekend for the governorship were direct primaries. And if you remember, one of the reasons for the president withholding his assent to the electoral amendment bill was because, fine, the governors, some of the governors objected to the whole idea of primaries and said, let it be the choice of the political parties, not that there will be an imposition of direct primaries rather than indirect primaries. So Osun had direct primaries, that's to say members of the political party, even though there were allegations or claims that non-members of the party participated in some of the areas, which would then be an open primary. But they had the indirect primaries, and the heavens did not fall.
Well, the positive development is that, well, every atmosphere has its own peculiarity. Osun was able to handle its own. And the contention, as far as the electoral bill was concerned, was that whether or not to restrict all political parties to direct primaries. In a democracy, people should be given the options of choice. And those have been now elaborately been provided. The worry now is that it's getting to over 30 days. By Tuesday, I think, it will be about 30 days, the mandatory period for assenting. And it seemed to be there seems to be no information committee, and an independent National Electoral Commission is getting worried because it will directly or indirectly affect its preparation for the 2023 elections.
Well, the president only just returned from Brussels at the weekend, and he hasn't indicated what his attitude will be to the bill as transmitted to him. So we'll see how things play out by tomorrow. And the issue of fuel scarcity, I think it's abating in the Federal Capital Territory. By Saturday, a number of filling stations had resumed sale, and by yesterday, there were virtually no queues. The only thing is that I think some of the fuel station attendants are holding fuel cleaners, or injector cleaners, as you call them. In the past, when you were topping up your tank at
practically beg you to buy.
Absolutely. Now they are telling you, no, guys, it's not available. It's not available. I said, no problem. My car is still moving well. With the last job I gave it with the fuel cleaner. So I don't want to get myself into a situation that the same thing with other motorists. By the time some persons say that, oh, the thing is scarce now, they go and put bleach inside the container and then cover it and seal it and sell it for you. By the time you use it, then another issue altogether. But what we feared or what we suspected, even though this is still early stage, that what set all of this in motion was a failure of inspection.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. It's failure of inspection. People were used to a template, and methanol was not on that template. So they didn't test for methanol, and that methanol escaped through the gate. And so it's pure failure of gatekeeping by the inspectors. But be that as it may, the Nigerian Accident Investigation Bureau of the Aviation has indicated that between the period of 1969 and 2022, a period of 53 years, a total of 2,038 lives have been lost in air crashes in the country. And he says that 1,996 were on board, while 42 were on ground at the airports. But be that as it may, the AIA, Accident Investigation Bureau, still said that air travel is still the safest and the fastest modes of travel around the world. But there has been international developments. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, has now brought out a manual that will now enable quick information about victim and accident victims.
Over the weekend as well, there was a strong windstorm across northern Europe. And there were videos that circulated of pilots struggling to land at Heathrow Airport. Those pilots are deserving of enormous praise. One of the aircraft, the British Airways aircraft, you could see it from the livery on its tail. It was a British Airways aircraft. As the plane, got just to touch down on the tarmac, the wind was so strong that the plane took off again. And I mean, I didn't see it very clearly, but it appeared that the tail probably just grazed the tarmac and then took off again. On another aircraft, you could see it, that the way it was banking left and right, banking left and right. But happily, there was no ugly incident, no accident, and I'm sure the passengers who were on those flights would have had their hearts in their mouths. I mean, on some domestic flights, we do experience that, but not that kind of dramatic incident. But Bayo, you would look around and read the papers. Nobody was writing with 200 cheat deaths, as normally you will find in some of our Nigerian media.
Sensational headlines.
Sensational headlines.
Yes.
The fact that an aircraft is involved in an incident doesn't necessarily mean that it will be an accident and that it will then result in fatalities. I mean, a pilot in New York City landed on the river.
Yes.
New York City, as busy and
Potomac River.
Absolutely, landed on the river, and then there was no life was lost.
Because prior to landing, he had already called for Mayday and indicated the likely position he was going to land, and there was emergency support on ground ready for it. Well, there is some development about COVID-19 The 95-year-old Queen Elizabeth II of United Kingdom is reported to have tested positive to COVID-19. Buckingham Palace reports that Her Majesty is still going on with light duties while she's also keeping to her medical protocol. It may be recalled that Prince Charles and his consort, Camilla Parker, also tested positive some couple of days ago. Queen Elizabeth is supposed to celebrate his 70th year on the throne on February 6th. There had been plans for a elaborate ceremony, but that is still hanging in the balance. It may be recalled that she is now the longest reigning British monarch. 70 years on the throne.
70 years on the throne, that's quite long.
That's interesting. Bayo, I don't, maybe you have read this story about former Super Eagle defender. There's a feature story on him again in the Punch. His name is Kingsley Obieku.
Your namesake.
My namesake. He was a member of the dream team that won gold at the Atlanta Olympics, and he also played for the Super Eagles as a defender. The headline here says, "I wanted to sell my Olympic gold before I became a bus driver." You know, he has transformed, according to the writer to this headline, from being a tire mender, what you call a vulcanizer, a bus conductor, and now to a driver. He's, of course, battling with issues of life. The medical examination indicates that he has an enlarged heart. But happily, Musa, that's the captain, Ahmed Musa, the captain of the Super Eagles, has reached out to him on the personal level to say that the other members of the Super Eagles, current and past, would help to rally around him. But Ahmed Musa sent him a donation of 2 million naira. But of course,
immediately the news came out. I think just hours, in just,
that's very encouraging. Yes. Very high sense of camaraderie.
I think he stopped playing because of the heart. You know, his brother died on the field. Yes, his brother died on the field some years back, and I remember him carrying Kanu Nwankwo on his shoulder.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Incidentally, Kanu Nwankwo had some heart problems, but luckily it was detected early.
He had the support of his club,
and he played for several years.
Yes. When he went for his medicals, that was when it was detected. So we wish him good health and
recovery.
Speedy recovery. So, Bayo, in the absence of any other story of interest?
None that I have.
Thank you so much for coming, Bayo.
So, motion for adjournment approved.
Thank
you very much.
We'll take a break. When we return, our conversation will begin. You're still watching Good Morning Nigeria on the network service of the NTA. We'll now kickstart our conversation segment on the fourth quarter 2021 GDP growth with this background report by correspondent Abdusalam Jibril.
Like many economies around the world that have been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, experts note that the Nigerian economy is witnessing an improvement in economic performance compared to 2020 when COVID-19 was endemic. Available data from the National Bureau of Statistics reveals that the country's gross domestic product, GDP, grew by 3.98% year-on-year in real terms in the fourth quarter of 2021, showing a sustained positive growth for the fifth consecutive quarter since the recession witnessed in 2020, when output contracted by -6.10% and -3.62% in the second and third quarter of 2020, respectively. Some experts maintain that the growth rate of 3.98% in the fourth quarter of 2021 and the overall growth of 3.4% for the year indicates a steady recovery of the economy. They attributed the growth to the non-oil sector, which accounts for 4.73% of the GDP growth, a reflection of higher activities in the economic circle. Recall that the Nigerian economy exited the COVID-19 induced recession in the fourth quarter of 2020 with a marginal GDP growth rate of 0.11%. Since then, the economy has witnessed 4 consecutive quarters of positive growth that includes 0.51% in the first quarter of 2021, 5.01% in the second quarter, and 4.03% in the third quarter of 2021. On the non-oil sector, the sector recorded a growth of 4.73% in the fourth quarter of 2021 in real terms, an improvement from 1.69% reported in the fourth quarter of 2020. The fastest growing non-oil sectors include air transport, rail transport and pipeline, road transport, coal mining, metal ores, quarrying and other minerals, as well as financial institutions. How can this improvement be sustained? Can Nigeria achieve full diversification of the economy away from the dependence on oil revenues? How does it translate to better living for Nigerians? Guests on the program will be speaking to issues around the fourth quarter 2021 GDP growth of the economy shortly.
Indeed, our guests are seated here in the studio, and joining us to discuss the topic is Professor Owaleke. He is Professor of Capital Markets, Nasarawa State University. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Jumai. Good morning, Nigeria.
He's a regular guest here, and also in the studio is Dr. Tochukwu Okafo, an economic analyst with specialization on inflation and the economy. He's also a senior economic analyst with Business Day Media Limited. You're welcome to Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you, Jumai. Thank you for having me around.
Okay, we also have joining us via Zoom Dr. Muda Yusuf, is Chief Executive Officer, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises. He's also the former DG, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Also a regular. You're welcome to Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all Nigerians.
All right. Once again, our pleasure to have our guests with us this morning. Let's begin by trying to make sense of the numbers relating to GDP growth for last quarter of 2021 and the GDP growth also for the whole of 2021, what it means and what it also holds for the future. Professor Owaleke, let's start with you.
Thank you, Kinsley. Of course, what it means is that we are witnessing expansion in the economy. Kinsley, this is the first time we are recording a GDP growth that's above 3% since 2015. In 2015, you recall, the GDP growth rate was 2.7. And the closest we had since 2015 was in 2019 when we had 2.2%. Of course, you know that in 2020, the economy contracted by 1.92%. We also had a contraction in 2016. So coming from a contraction of 1.92% in 2020 to a growth rate of 3.4% in 2021, I think that's remarkable. Another remarkable thing is the fact that even when you remove the base effect, which we saw, what we call the base effect, which we saw in the second quarter and third quarter of 2021, you also notice that there was an improvement. On a quarter-on-quarter basis, if you look at that report, between quarter 3 and quarter 4 of 2021, the economy grew by 9.63%. So for me, that shows an improvement. And it also surpassed virtually all forecasts that we had for 2021. If you recall, the IMF had done a forecast of 2.5 for Nigeria. The central bank had predicted 3.1%. The federal government in the 2021 budget even targeted 3%. And here we are having 3.4%. So again, it's something to cheer about. So for me too, it means that some of the policies that are in place are beginning to work. That's one interpretation. I recall that the Finance Act of 2020 removed import duty on cars from reduced from 35% to 10%, waived the VAT on airline tickets for 2020. So that may have influenced positively the performance we saw in the transport sector. The transport sector, happens to be one of the sectors that printed the highest growth rate for in 2021. You saw in Q4 the transport sector recording as high as 29 points, close to 30%. Of course, that's where you have road and so on. So the policies that were introduced, yes, may have influenced the what we saw in the transport, even though it contributes less than 2%, to the overall GDP. So for me, I think the policies are working. If you also look at agriculture, for example, I also think some of the policies of the Central Bank of Nigeria may have impacted positively on the agric GDP. The agric sector grew by 3.58%. It may not be very strong growth compared to what we used to have. There was a time agric was growing at over 4%. But for me, what is remarkable is that from Q3 to Q4, okay, it moved from 1.22% on a year-on-year basis in Q3 to 3.58% in Q4. So for me, that was also an improvement. And this has happened, Kinsley, in spite of the drop in the oil output. The oil output fell to 1.5 million barrels per day. Meanwhile, what was the government was targeting 1.86, but it dropped to 1.5, and we still had this growth. So for me, another lesson there is that the oil sector is beginning to, the influence is beginning to wane in the sense that in Q4, oil sector contributed just 5.1%, to GDP. So the non-oil sector, is beginning to, take the upper hand, and it's a good thing that is sustained. And for me too, it's important that growth rate of above 3%, which is higher than population growth rate. Population growth rate is estimated at 2.6 on the average, and that is what we require if we have to get to a point where the masses, the common man, will begin to say, okay, we are feeling this, growth. So until we have a sustainable, strong GDP growth rate and an inclusive one, the masses will not feel it. But I think we have started on the right path by having this strong growth in GDP.
Oh, great. Dr. Tochukwu Okafor, 3.98%, let's say 3.4%. Did it meet your expectations?
While I'm a strong advocate of celebrating small wins as well as big ones, I'm also a realist, right? I call a spade, and I point out the cracks when need be. So, yeah, federal government did a good job by navigating Nigeria through that recession and coming out strong. I have to give it to them. On the flip side, that growth is not sustainable. It's unsustainable. If we're going to look at it the way it is, it's like comparing a malnourished child with a child that has a hereditary condition. Yeah, he has been eating, but is he healthy? The malnourished child standing beside him, he will look healthier than the child, but no. That was 2020 for us. Nothing was happening in that year, right? So whatever was happening in 2021, it looks good, but there are conditions that are there that lie underneath. So if you look at the second quarter, right? First quarter was 0.5, second quarter was 5. I think that was when the pandemic hit in 2020. That 5 is showing that nothing was actually happening, and that's why we have that 5. Then the reality starts setting in. We hit 4, then we hit 3. We're turning towards IMF's projection, the 2. Then the question now is, what is really causing this? There are a lot of things. First, let's start with the one that is pressing, the one CBN is fighting inflation, right? If you look at the inflation figures for 2012 down to 2014, you see that we were in single digits. We were hitting 5, 6, 5, 6. Look at 2015 down when we started hitting double digits. We started hitting 2, 1, -1, 2, 2, 2. And that shows you that because Nigeria's inflation rate was earmarked, Nigeria's economic growth blueprint, sustainable, was earmarked on single-digit inflation. So being in double digits, there's a misnomer there. So we've been on 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and we're tending back down that line. So what we have now is an inflation rate of 15.6, and then you ask yourself, what is driving it? If you've checked all the data since last year, you see that it's food inflation that's been driving it. It's been between 20 and 17. Now you ask yourself again, what is driving food inflation? You go to those food belts, you see that there's drought, flooding, but most importantly, there's insecurity, right? Insecurity is what's making people put a price on their life, not necessarily the food. So you have that already there. So that means inflation is already showing us that we are not going to sustain this 3.4 this year. Second, when you talk about core, our importation level is on the high side, right? We've been doing deficit for almost, even though deficit has been reducing, but we've still been in deficit. But not to brain on that parade, let's just leave that one. The one that we're supposed to be fighting is tackling insecurity. You look at another condition that we have, talk about the oil sector, right? If you look at the oil sector, you see that we have brought back subsidy. The problem now is, see the misnomer here, how can an oil-producing nation be crying when the prices of oil are going up? That's oxymoronic. I keep saying that. I keep saying it.
What did you say again?
Oxymoronic is an oxymoron, right? How can I be a pepper seller and I'll be vexing when the prices of pepper is actually rising? That doesn't even make sense. The problem is the subsidy. So where the revenues that you're supposed to be using for infrastructure and other economic benefits are going into sustaining that subsidy, you have little to even feature for your debt and even the payments. That is one side. You look at the reports. From the GDP report, you notice that, like Professor said, the oil sector was underperforming. Oil sector was doing minus 8.3, while the other sectors were performing well. That shows you that there's a problem. This is a major source of revenue. Let us face it. Unless if we're going to navigate to other forms of energy, this is still a major source of revenue. And then it leads me to the other problem of debt, right? We have a debt problem that has been bedeviling us for almost, in fact, let's not go back to it, but we have a debt problem. And the US right now is planning next month, a couple of weeks from now, the Feds are actually planning on increasing their rates. And we are dealing, well, we've been sustaining ourselves on ways and means and mainly Eurobonds. So if we're going to subscribe another Eurobond after this increase, our debt servicing is going to increase. So from that 92, we might be seeing 96 if care is not taken. So with these compounded problems, we need to face the reality. Yes, he looks healthy, but are the conditions there keeping that health sustainable enough? So the healthy child not necessarily means we should start celebrating that he's more healthy than the malnourished child, right? He is looking healthy, but how sustainable is that health is what we're supposed to be talking about. So basically, big thumbs up to the 3.4, but let's try and push it to 4, 5 by fixing all these hereditary conditions, like I like to call them, in the medium term, so that in the medium term, I keep saying it, 4 or 5 years from now, we'll be celebrating this, but at higher levels, 6, 7. Yeah, God willing.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kafo. We'll return to you. Let's bring in Dr. Muda Yusuf. Dr. Muda, again, what do you make of these numbers?
Good morning once again. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Well, just as my colleagues in the studio have said, this is an improvement over what we had last year. And quite a number of factors have been responsible for this. First is what we call the base effect, which Professor Waleke alluded to. You know, the figures we are looking at is a year-on-year figure. We are comparing 2021 to 2020. As we all know, 2020 was a particularly very bad year because that was at the peak of the pandemic. So practically all sectors contracted in that year. I'm talking of 2020, apart from sectors like the ICT, agric, financial services, and the cement subsector. All the other sectors contracted. So when you are comparing an extremely bad year, and don't forget, we also had a recession in 2020. So when you have an extremely bad year, and you are comparing it to a year where we are beginning to see some recovery, obviously, you are likely to see this kind of significant jump in the GDP numbers. So the base effect was a very, very strong factor, which we must realize. Secondly, historically, there's always a correlation between oil price and the GDP growth performance. The average oil price in 2020 was $42 per barrel. In 2021, the average oil price was $70 per barrel. Yes, we had issues with outputs, but the price also had an impact, in terms of the performance of the economy and the performance of the GDP. So the oil price recovery was also a factor. Then the third very important factor was the fact that the economy generally was coming back to life by 2021. All the issues of restrictions, travel restrictions, the lockdowns, the supply chain disruptions, all those issues abated significantly in 2021. So when you now begin to see the restoration of economic activities, people are able to travel and all of that, that also contributed significantly to the growth performance that we saw. The fourth factor is the fact that the government, through its both monetary and fiscal policies, put in place the economic sustainability plan. The total value of that plan was 2.3 trillion. I'm not sure whether the entire thing was expended, but that also had a significant effect on the GDP numbers. So those were the factors that led to this. So we need to identify those factors to be able to appreciate the extent to which it is the unfolding scenario of recovery of economic activities had impacted, and to the extent to which we can say it is a policy-driven recovery. But having said that, economy is about human beings. It's about welfare. It's about productivity. Because when we say that the economy has recovered and this is the highest growth since 7 years, if you go out there to talk to the average Nigerian, not many Nigerians will agree with you that the economy is doing well. Because there is still a big gap between this data and the impact on the lives of the people, the prosperity of businesses, the job creation situation, the profit situation, the mortality of businesses, and all of that. So the nexus between the GDP growth, poverty reduction, investment growth, productivity in the economy, this nexus is also very, very important. Because in the last 1 year, what inflation had drawn to the welfare of the people is almost unprecedented. Even though we talk about inflation at 15.6%, slightly decelerating. But for many of the goods that are consumed by the average citizens, you'll be talking of inflation of close to 50%. Because we had seriously galloping inflation. I know what inflation does to income of people in terms of erosion of purchasing power, effect on welfare. You know what it does even to businesses, cost of production, erosion of profit margins, sustainability of investment. So this nexus is extremely important. So that as we reckon with the fact that the figures are looking good, we should also reckon with all these metrics that addresses or that focuses on welfare issues, on productivity issues, on investment issues, and issues of economic inclusion, issues of income inequality. Because at the end of the day, this is what matters most to most Nigerians and to most investors. See what has happened to our currency in the last 1 year. And look at the very serious implication of currency depreciation that we have seen in the last 1 year. Those things are not very good stories that you can tell either the citizens or the economic players. So those are my perspectives for now.
So Muda Yusuf, I'm still going to stay with you briefly. You know, we're talking about sustainability. Let's look at the driving sectors in this quarter and how they can be able to sustain this growth that we have.
I didn't quite get you.
We're talking about sustainability. What are the driving sectors in the economy that will sustain this growth that we have now?
Well, if I heard you clearly, I think we are talking about factors that can sustain the growth.
Yes.
Yeah, of course, there are quite a number of factors. First is to, apart from sustaining the growth, we should be talking about connecting the growth to welfare, connecting the growth to productivity. That is important. Secondly, in terms of sustaining this growth and making it a lot more inclusive, we need to do a lot more about the investment environment. Now, if you talk to those who are investors now, the cost of energy is going out of the roof. The cost of diesel now is over 400. Look at what is happening to aviation fuel. Look at the implication of flight and all of that. So the energy cost issue is a major issue. The issue of the macroeconomic environment, because if you don't have a good and stable macroeconomic environment, it is difficult to have the kind of growth that we like to see. Growth that is sustainable and growth that is inclusive. A growth that will allow a lot more small businesses to thrive. We are not just talking about big business. The small businesses thriving impacts a lot more on the economy. Now look at what is happening to inflation and currency and the exchange rate. These are very important macroeconomic indices or indicators that we need to watch. 15.6% inflation is high. And just as I said, if you isolate some basket of goods, in some cases, prices have doubled. So we need to see what you can do, both from the fiscal and the monetary side, on the issues of inflation. We also need to come up with policies that will address currency depreciation and currency volatility and liquidity problem in the foreign exchange markets, because that is also having a very serious pass-through effect. Then there are issues, again, of reforms. We have attempted to reform the oil and gas sector, just as my colleague said. Because of political considerations, we are not able to move forward with it. And now the president has now transmitted a request to the National Assembly asking for 2.5 trillion. So at the end of the day, they're spending 3 trillion. These things have implications for the fiscal operations of government. It has implications for the deficit that we are going to incur at the end of the year. It has implications for inflation. It has implications for CBN financing of deficits. All of these issues have very distortionary effects. They affect inflation, they affect welfare, they affect cost of production. So these are macroeconomic issues flowing from issues of forex management, issues of fiscal operations, issues of inability to push through reforms, and all of that. And of course, we have regulatory issues. I've listened to the National Assembly leaders pushing all the MDAs to go and generate revenue. Now, at the end of the day, many of these MDAs will now be bouncing on investors, they will be bouncing on the private sector to generate revenue. The National Assembly is not talking so much about how to reduce cost of governance. All they are pushing the MDAs to do is to go and generate revenue. So we also need to caution, because if you keep putting a lot of pressure on investors in this economy in the name of wanting to generate revenue, it's going to hurt investment. It's going to hurt the ability to create jobs. It's going to create more unemployment and even aggravate poverty. So these are the things that we need to worry about. Of course, we have structural issues, which are also some long-term issues like the roads, the power situation, the issues of the ports, and these are legacy problems that we are still grappling with.
Dr. Muda Yusuf, thank you very much there for your insights. So again, we'll return to you in the course of the conversation. Now back to the Abuja studios. Professor Waleke, we know that we can, of course, take up some of the points that each of you had, has touched on. But let's discuss much more deeply the numbers for 2021. You all agree that the base year for it is 2020, and that was a year, or if you like, global economic paralysis. So seeing what we saw in 2021 is like saying, oh, something wasn't happening in a year, and then you see 2021, you're saying, oh yeah, things are happening, and Dr. Kafo says that it might give a deceptive impression that we're actually doing well. But when you look at the factors that have also been adduced as the drivers for the numbers, including what Dr. Muda Yusuf said, the ESPN has been a critical component of this. If the government voted 2.3 trillion naira and the government spent even say 1 trillion naira, including the budgetary allocation, what might have been if the government said, okay, you know, there's global economic paralysis, let's ride this out without the kind of stimulus packages, some of which hit target, some of which may not have hit their target. What might have been, therefore, if we had no ESPN?
Well, perhaps by now we'll still be talking about very, very tepid, real GDP growth rates. Or perhaps by now.
I said it. ESPN.
Yes.
ESPN is a sports channel. Economic
sustainability plan.
ESPN. So that's economic. This is ESP. Yes. But we can also say ESPN, Economic Sustainability Plan for Nigeria.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I listened to the central bank governor. I think during the last MPC meeting. I think he talked about the central bank releasing or using as much as 3 trillion, naira in terms of tackling the interventions in various areas to tackle the pandemic. If not for these injections, these interventions, I think the economy by now would still be perhaps still in the doldrums. At least what you can see now is that, yes, we may not be there yet, but the economy is already on the path of recovery. Why people, may not be feeling that is because of some of the points that have been, mentioned here. One of which is inflation. Okay, we know that inflation rate in 2020 was very high. As a matter of fact, in 2020, the economy was in a stagflation mode. Stagflation, where you have rising inflation, and at the same time, you have an economy that is contracting or even stagnating. That's stagflation. We had that in 2020. But as I said earlier on, for me, the good news is that some of these numbers appear to be improving, one of which is this GDP. The other is even the inflation. Inflation rate moderating to 15.6, okay, from as high as, at one point it was over, it was close to 20%. So the major challenge we have now, today in Nigeria, for us to ensure that the masses or the common man begins to feel the impact is to tackle this issue of inflation. For me, I see it as a silver bullet. If we tackle inflation, bring it down to single digits, the central bank, mind you, has 6% to 9% target as inflation target, but it's been in excess of 15%. The target for 2022 budget is 13%, still double digits. So until we wrestle inflation, okay, Dr. Muda had, of course, told us the implications of, rising inflation. Apart from weakening the purchasing power, we know that inflation also has an effect even on exchange rate. Inflation affects interest rates, because if inflation rate is rising, nobody gives credit without having in mind the inflation rates in terms of interest. So it affects interest rate, it affects exchange rate. So we need to tackle inflation. If inflation comes down reasonably, then the common man in the street, if he can go to the market and his little naira is able to purchase things, then it makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, Professor Waleke. Yeah, it's an issue that we have to address, namely the management of inflation. How did we get it right when in this same economy, inflation was at single digit? So what is it that we are not getting right now? That is to say, the monetary authorities. What is it they are not doing right now, but that was done right when inflation was single digit?
Yes, but the challenge we have now is that inflation in this country today is not demand driven. So it's not something that you push to the monetary, authority. The fiscal side also has a lot of role to play. Okay, in a situation where the fiscal authority, borrows so much, of course that raises interest rates. That also has a pass-through, on inflation. So the fiscal side is also there. Okay, what are the factors that are driving inflation in Nigeria today? They are mainly cost-push factors. You talk about the high cost of, transport. Okay, Dr. Yusuf mentioned the issue of energy. Yeah. Cost of electricity, for example, okay, is a major cost of inflation in the country. Cost of fuel, the fuel that we buy. So when you take all these factors into consideration, and the high cost of transport, and the insecurity too, he mentioned earlier, okay, that's affecting the food inflation, because food inflation is where the challenge is, okay, which we hear is highest in a state like Kogi, at over 20%, 22%. That's talking about the one in Kogi. On the average is 17.1%. So the way for me to go about it is to tackle it from that fiscal side, okay? And for the monetary authority, I think they are applying the right tools or panacea. The monetary policy tools have reached their limits. That's why you hardly find the central bank trying to tackle inflation by using the traditional monetary policy tools. So what they are doing now, okay, is to focus on the developmental aspect, the interventions in the agricultural space in particular, which is also why I am happy that this initiative by the Central Bank of Nigeria called the RT 200, the race to $200 billion forex repatriation, will be a good one, if well implemented, because what that would do, if we can attract $200 billion into this economy on an annual basis, you can imagine what the effects it will have on our external reserves. You can imagine the effects it will have on exchange rate. So we'll now rely less on the proceeds from oil to be able to manage the exchange rate. So this issue of exchange rate management now, becomes easier for the central bank. The central bank can as well ask, or rather allow market forces to determine the exchange rate of the naira. But that is when that is done. So to come to your question, specifically, I think what the government should be doing, okay, should be to also look at these other macro areas that will help sustain this economic growth. Economic growth, we say, is a necessary condition for economic development. We need to even have that growth before we can talk about, its inclusiveness. But of course, it has to be inclusive. It has to be able to tackle jobs. Unemployment rate remains very high. And as long as unemployment rate is high, as long as inflation rate is high, people, the common man, will not say he's feeling the impact of the growth.
Professor Waleke, you've really, raised a lot of pertinent questions there, but we need to bring in our guest who has just joined us now, as economic analyst Dushau Aliu. You're welcome to Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you. Good morning.
We've been talking about the fourth quarter, 3.4% growth in the fourth quarter of 2021. Let's have your perspective on what it means from an economic point of view before we go deeper with you.
Mostly all economic policies are geared toward achieving target. Some of the target as measured by consistently by the central bank is to see a change or a positive development to our GDP, and it has been recorded. Despite the fact that there has been certain hindrances when you take, for instance, the projections of certain international monetary organizations like IMF, and also looking at also the contraction of the world economy. So, but to me, it's a good development, and at the same time also is in line with the projections government is making. But the contending issue most of the time is when we look at the priorities of the administration, that is to take many people out of poverty. Remember, Mr. President in 2020 highlighted that the kind of GDP that he wants to have in this economy is GDP with prosperity. And there is no way you continue to have GDP growth without prosperity, and you now think of developing the purchasing power of individuals. In my own opinion, there is a lot of issues. And some of the contending issues to which we must work with the realistic sampling of our economy. Let us understand, first of all, the population. If you don't know the number of population in an economy for a very long period of time, you don't know the demographic challenges in that same population growth, you continue to have GDP growth rate without prosperity, because whatever that comes into the government purse, whatever that comes to the investors, there are certain consistent policies to put on ground. These policies geared toward human capital development. This human capital development is what will ease all this stagnation tension, where you have high unemployment, where you have high inflation, and at the same time you have certain socio-economic factors as challenges. This economy is also suffering what the world economy is suffering, supply bottlenecks. This supply bottlenecks has to do with what is produced within the economy and those things that are also necessary outside the economy. Let me give you an instance. We have been capitalizing that we must produce what we eat. Of course, when we produce, the contribution of agriculture is very, very significant to the growth of GDP growth rate. But what are the commodities involved? And what are the, for instance, the growth rate recorded looking into consideration other factors? Other factors like pricing policies, food security in all ramifications. Even if you have GDP growth rate of 3.4% for the general economy, you look at the sectoral contribution to that GDP. And when you take agriculture, there is improvement in agricultural engagement in the economy, but still the allocation of resources, particularly household resources, income, has remained stagnant. So when you continue, when income remains stagnant and people are getting out every day in the economy to be out of income coverage, for instance, with the banditry, you destroy communities, you destroy their income, you destroy their livelihood, you continue to have GDP without prosperity.
Okay, Ishal, thank you very much for your opening salvo. I just would like us to pursue further this whole idea around the linkage of GDP growth to welfare, productivity, and therefore prosperity. I want to bring in again Dr. Muda, who is still with us via Zoom. Well, inflation has been identified as one of the factors negatively impacting on welfare, productivity, welfare, and prosperity. And Professor Uche Owaleke was a doctor before he became a prof, by the way, has also said that, look, in dealing with inflation, we have to look at the double entry. You look at the monetary side, you also look at the fiscal side. Fiscal side arising from government borrowing and so on and so forth. Is it possible that what we are seeing are, if you like, temporary but inevitable effects of what government has had to do? Namely, at the time we were in recession, and Dr. Muda and Professor Owaleke, you were our regular guests from 2016 on and right up to this moment. The idea was you have to spend your way out of recession. And when you borrow and you spend wisely, you will be in a position to stimulate a wide variety of sectors, diversify the economy, have less reliance crude oil output and crude oil sales, so that if we are spending now, if we are spending what we borrowed and we're having to pay back and inflation is here with us, could this therefore be temporary consequences of what we had done, and that going forward this might wear off, and then we have a plateau that ensures that we are probably able to manage inflation at single digits?
Well, although there's a bit of audio challenges, but let me attempt to respond to what I think you have saying. It's about inflation and all the macroeconomic issues and how we can deploy the appropriate fiscal and monetary policy tools. Let me say that some of these things are actually legacy policy problems. I say they are legacy policy problems because these things have been coming with us for quite a while. As a youth corper in the mid-80s, our allowance at that time was 200 naira. And with 200 naira, we were able to live comfortably, and we even had savings at youth corpers. At that time, people were buying brand new cars for 10,000 naira, for 6,000 naira, brand new cars. I'm saying this in order to illustrate how badly we have managed our macroeconomic environment. At that time, naira to the dollar was maybe 5 naira to the dollar, or 6 naira, or at best 10 naira to the dollar. Today we are talking about 570 naira to the dollar. These are some of the fundamental problems. I mean, look at other countries. How many countries have had that kind of trajectory over the last 30 years in terms of how they have degraded their currency? So the macroeconomic management is very, very important. And this is why it is important, again, to have a central kind of management of the economy, so that you don't have agencies of government operating in silos based on their own understanding. Economics is a science. It's not something that everybody just jump into and feel that you understand how an economy works. We need somebody to coordinate the way we manage the economy, and somebody that we can, whose authority we can respect. That is not happening. And look at what it has, where it has brought us to. So the whole macroeconomic management system over the years, I think we got it wrong. And that is one of the biggest drivers of poverty. Because in this period I was telling you, people who are in level 4, level 5, and it may be even less than 100 naira, they didn't have to look up to anybody to feed. They didn't have to look up to anybody to meet their basic needs, because the income they had was sufficient for them to live. But we have battered all of that. Now, secondly, the monetary side. When the finance minister was presenting the budget review session, and she made a review of 2021 budget performance, she told the public that 76% of government revenue was spent to service debt as at November. These were actual figures. So when you say that you spend your way out of all of these things, it depends on what kind of spending. Now, with the new supplementary budget, our budget is likely to go to close to 20 trillion. Where is the revenue to support that kind of expenditure? So at the end of the day, most of the borrowing that will come will also go into recurrent. Then a good number of the borrowing will also come from central bank, which will further compound the inflationary problem, which will further compound the macroeconomic problem. Nobody is talking about how we can cut down costs. And as at 2021, the interest payments on borrowing from central bank was 1.1 trillion. That's what we were told by the finance minister. 1.1 trillion interest payments from borrowing from central bank. So you are talking about something now in terms of principal in the neighborhood of 10 trillion and above. I know when money is coming from central bank, you know the inflationary effect this will have. So we need to manage first the way we borrow and what we borrow for. Yes, you can borrow and spend your way, but when you have a situation where even a good portion of the borrow is going to recurrent because your revenue cannot match even the recurrent expenditure, you will have a problem.
Okay.
So we need to bring a whole lot of discipline into our entire macroeconomic management.
Okay.
Then we need to address issues of productivity. Agri accounts for 26% of GDP. What is the productivity in agriculture? People are still using hoes and cutlasses, and the population is growing.
Yes.
No, these are some of the things. Whatever we need to do, we need to look at productivity issues across all sectors.
Okay.
And we need to also look at the way our regulators operate. We need to address our port issues. As we speak, getting things in and out of the port is still an issue. And Professor Waleke alluded to this RT 200 scheme of the central bank. How do you boost exports if you don't have productivity? How do you boost exports earnings if your currency, foreign exchange management is as rigid as it is? We have a wide gap between the official window and the parallel market window. How will inflows come in? Official window is 416. Parallel market is 570. How do we expect people to bring in foreign exchange into the economy? It can't work. So we need to deal with issues of even the foreign exchange management itself. We have been on this for close to 5 years or so. So these are some of the fundamental things I think we need to address.
All right, Dr. Muda, thank you very much. I'm sure you heard part of my question, and the latter part of your response addressed the fuller details that were embedded in my question. I would like Dr. Okafo to also pitch in here to say, look, it's not the situation, some persons would argue, that the government has been engaged in reckless borrowing. To say, look, we're borrowing for a purpose, with the argument from 2016 was, look, spend your way out of the recession. And we got out of it after 18 months or thereabout. And the argument also has arisen that this could very well be the temporary effects. When you borrow, you have to pay back. I mean, these are sovereign debts in the first instance. And that the cumulative returns from the effects of borrowing might not begin to manifest until probably sometime in the not too distant future, by which time we would reach a level of comfort, if you like, and then head back to single-digit inflation and be able to energize the various sectors of the economy. But how long, in your view, can we manage the consequences right now of government borrowing and therefore the fiscal side of what we need to do in managing inflation?
So, a wise man once said, when the purpose of a concept is not known, abuse is inevitable. If we look at it holistically, right, the concept of this whole economic crisis is not black and white. There are different, various complexities that are actually causing this. And like you said, like you rightly said, if they had channeled it to the right sources, which they said they were borrowing for, we wouldn't necessarily, we might be here, but it won't be this bad, right? For instance, peradventure, if we were manufacturing our own crude, I don't think we would have been in this crisis we currently are.
If we're refining our own petroleum.
Refining, and you understand, if we were refining our own petroleum, we wouldn't be in this situation we're in. Probably the inflationary effect of what we are going to experience after this might not occur, because this dirty petrol crisis, like I said, is going to have inflationary consequences. And this all goes back to the fact that because we are not producing, there will be consequences as a result of this consistent importations and bringing in whatever we need to bring in. So if we had the right infrastructure in place to put all these things in place, it does not necessarily mean that these challenges will not come up. They will come up, but they will be managed adequately, right? So if you look at this petrol crisis, and we cannot overemphasize this inflation, because the inflation is the main problem within this thing. If you, go to, the news came up, like he said, like Dr. Muda said, a news came up last week that there are some states that have not yet implemented their minimum wage. And gross domestic product is that the economy is producing and there's wealth that is circulating, right? If there are some people that are still in this economy, that the minimum wage is not even sustainable to hold any family, are not even earning it, how much more the circulation of wealth? Now, coming down to the inflation pattern of it, if there is consistent inflation, no matter how much we borrow, the inflationary impact will continue to eat into whatever we are borrowing to actually achieve, right? So if it continues to eat, it's not a temporary, it's not a permanent, but it's a long-term project. It's going to take a lot. There will be a lot of sacrifices. A lot of sacrifices in the part of government. There's a lot of sacrifices from the people, like he said. But the holistic picture in itself is that it's not necessary. The mistake was made, like you said, from 2016. 2016, if these things were channeled to the right investments that were necessary, we won't be in this mess. Take, for instance... I
didn't say there was a mistake in 2016.
No, I'm not saying that it's a mistake. I'm saying if it was channeled to the right direction, right? Like, if you look at some of the underperforming sectors, right? Education is one of them. I'm going to go to education because that is something that is going to sustain us in the long run. There was a report that came out about the unknown children of Abuja. These people are going to grow up tomorrow and they're going to take seats of government. If they don't understand the necessary fundamentals of how to run the economy, how much more the people that are actually trying to groom them. Do you understand? So the problem now is, because of the unsustainable nature of these finances that have already happened, the ripple effects are going to take a longer term, because those were long-term projects that were supposed to, those funds were supposed to be channeled into. So if those long-term projects were not channeled into, the implications of of those funds not being adequately channeled to those directions are going to have long-term implications. It's that simple. So the implications are going to be long-term regardless, but sustaining it can be managed in a balanced format. Like I said, like my professor said, the CBN is doing the best they can. That limit, they cannot shake it. But if you look here, we're dealing with cost push as well as demand pull inflation, right? We have supply chain disruptions, that's the demand side of it, and then we are adding cost push with the current fall crisis. So it's not something that there is a textbook format on, hey, this is what we're going to do and get out of it. But the sustainability of how to manage it and then start reducing the impact over time is what we're going to do, but it's going to be long-term, guaranteed.
Okay, Dr. Tochukwu Okafor, thank you so much for your input. We'll be taking a break right now. When we return, our conversation will continue. Do stay. Welcome back, and you're still watching Good Morning Nigeria. Professor Oleke, let me come to you. We're talking about welfare, productivity, prosperity, and Dr. Muda raised a lot of pertinent questions which I'm sure you want to respond. But let's talk about the rising concern about our debt profile here in Nigeria. And what, in your opinion, do you think Nigeria should, where do you think Nigeria should channel her money, our income into, to ensure that we maintain this growth and maybe grow beyond it in the next 2 years or so?
Thank you very much, Jumai. Before I come to the debt issue, an issue that Dr. Muda mentioned, the RT 200 program of the Central Bank of Nigeria. That program has a number of components, one of which is the value-added export component, and that is meant to emphasize processing, so we don't end up exporting just raw agri products. We get to a point where what we export from Nigeria are mainly processed goods. Okay, so because when you export raw agri products, whether it is yam or it is cocoa, they don't command much value. So I think part of why that program is on is to incentivize export of processed goods, and of course that will also impact positively on the manufacturing GDP. because when you're processing it will, part of that will now move into manufacturing. You talked about the agri sector, not being productive enough because of the traditional means of going about it. So I think that program, I said, if it's well implemented, will impact on manufacturing. Manufacturing sector by the Q4 of 2021, going by the National Bureau of Statistics and reports, actually dropped from 3.8 in quarter 3 to just 2 point something in quarter 4. So even though and contributed just about 8% to GDP. So we need to ramp up the manufacturing sector growth. And one way to do that is, in my view, what the central bank is talking about now, the ROT 200. Now, on the issue of export, the bottlenecks at the ports, one of the components, that's information I want to provide, and I'm sure he's aware, one of the components of that program is the dedicated export terminal facility. So for all those exports, the central bank is saying that they're going to finance a dedicated export terminal, to bypass all the bottlenecks associated with exporting goods. So I think it is a good one. If well implemented, it will, as I said earlier on, impact positively on the economy, on productivity, on GDP, on external reserves, and so on. The other thing on productivity I want to mention has to do with focusing attention on what I call the accelerators. They may not be contributing much to GDP, but we need to focus on them because they are the ones that will accelerate growth and also improve the productivity we are talking about. One of these sectors is education. If you look at the NBS figures, education contributes less than 3%. As a matter of fact, 2.2% to overall GDP. Okay, and in the NBS report too, if you look at the growth there, it grew by less than 3%. The health sector is another. Health sector contributed 0.75% to overall GDP.
With all the hospitals?
No, but it grew. In terms of growth, it grew. It's one of the sectors that grew by more than 5%, the health sector, but the contribution is low. So we need to focus attention on these social development, these sectors, human capital sectors, education and health. And that is why I think that government should do whatever it can to ensure that strikes don't happen at any of the educational levels. Okay, so this is not a time to entertain strikes in the universities, for example. So I am also seizing the opportunity to say that government should ensure that this warning strike doesn't backed on by universities don't so that they should do everything to meet whatever agreement they have entered into with ASU. Now, on the issue of borrowing, my concern about borrowing for a country like Nigeria, sometimes you find it as inevitable. If you look at our stock of infrastructure, we are about 35% to GDP, one of the least in Africa. Infrastructure stock to GDP is about 35%. In South Africa, it's about 80%. So how do you fill that gap? You can only fill that gap if you also spend in infrastructure. But how do you spend? Spending doesn't mean that you must, there are other ways by which you can tackle infrastructure. So my idea of my concern about borrowing is that if you look at the instrument that we're using to do domestic debt, for example, we're using more of FGN bond. That's what we do. It's not specifically tied to infrastructure. The real infrastructure, if you like, instruments in the domestic debt stock is less than 3%. That's talking about green bonds, talking about Sukuk. Sukuk is an infrastructure bond. So those ones are little. These are the things I think we should scale up and do less of FGM bond that when you get, you can apply, you are free to, apply to any proceeds. The same thing goes, applies to the Euro bond. I'm also not too comfortable when we often go for Euro bonds because they are more expensive and there are other risks associated with Euro bonds. So I think, but I'm happy that the National Development Plan, if you look at the National Development Plan, okay, it says that the private sector, will provide much of the funds for that plan. Okay, over 80% will be done by the private sector. So in future, you asked whether it's going to be temporary or permanent. I think it's going to be temporary. If you look at that national development plan, that national development plan, puts a lot of emphasis on the private sector providing these funds for development, which ordinarily should, should be the ideal.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Uche Waleke. Yusha Waliu, let's bring you again into the conversation. We're getting pressed for time to wrap up. Now, the point has been made by some of the guests onto this program that the government's supplementary budget, which is aimed at raising over 2 trillion naira or more for fuel subsidy for the remainder of the year, is going to have a negative impact ultimately on the economy. I'm just wondering, is fuel subsidy really a waste? I'm asking this question against the background of the following. We're seeing oil prices now around about $90 per barrel, and our refining capacity remains limited at this stage. So if we were still largely dependent on refined petroleum imports, and prices are at this level, and you say no subsidy regime, and those refined products land on our shores, are we in a position to pay for it? That's to say, petrol, for instance. Somebody will tell you that, oh, diesel is already deregulated. Are we in a position to pay for it? Will that also not impact on food inflation? Will it not impact on transportation costs? Will it not impact even on welfare? Because if prices go up as fuel prices rise on account of a fully deregulated environment, will people therefore not be arguing that, oh, listen, our take-home can no longer take us home, and that the cost of living is pretty high? Is subsidy really a waste?
It's a double-edged sword. Looking at the fact that subsidy in certain intervention is just counterproductive. But however, there are circumstances at which subsidy is accepted in all economies. It's the same way with bailouts. We have seen how different economies under lockdown have made an intervention in order to sustain or to retain jobs. In my own opinion, government is paying for inefficiency, and that is just the subsidy regime of today. Because if NNP had been efficient enough, by now the issue of importing the premium motor spirit, which is attracting so much of our exchange reserve, is uncalled for. However, there are certain issues that are cogent. Every time policymakers must look at the exigencies in all economies. Presently, we are suffering. The greatest problem of the economy is high inflation. And this high inflation, if it is sustained, is going to make many people poor. And when you are making your people poorer, you are making your GDP negative. And when you are making your GDP negative, your development aspiration may not be achieved based on target. However, what are the best ways? The best ways to do it is that let us be more committed and sincere in deregulating this industry. There is Petroleum Industry Act is on ground now. But the subsidy that we are trying to explain or trying to now make a way for it, there must be subsidy. But the unfortunate situation is I am not expecting supplementary budget in less than 100 days. It's not done. It's not good. How can you, for instance, accent a budget on 31st of December and then make a supplementary? We are not in a war economy. We are recovering. And based on the GDP that we have recorded, it shows that our economy is working. So most of the macroeconomic aggregates that we are trying to translate into growth in this economy must be well understood by policymakers. PMS has come to stay in Nigeria. I used to say severally that if, for instance, Dangote with a capacity, with a Dangote refinery with a refining capacity of 650 million barrels per day, and it is expected to come in September, So it's a simple analogy. If NNPC has made provision for subsidy from January to June, then definitely the shortfall may be from June to September. Whatever Dangote is attempting to supply to the market, government can make an intervention. It's easy for us. It's easy for us to get our PMS from a refined capacity within the domestic economy. Cost effective, zero transport cost, and it is also to be well distributed in good time. That is one. Two, government has made certain under economic recovery and growth plan. There has been a situation where government has put special economic zones. All these economic zones, today we are not hearing anything about the economic zones and also the investment being made. We have started with, for instance, Investors Forum, but it has not graduated to that level. So I think if we are to maintain this subsidy cannot be maintained forever. But subsidy can be an intervention. The same with bailout, but it has to be followed with a more serious commitment of having refined capacity, not only from Dangote, but all these marketers who are willing to import. Why can't all these marketers be brought together, put their resources together, get a license, have another refinery to come up in less than 4 or 5 years? This will solve the issue, and it also help government in the future.
Okay, Yushal, thank you very much. And by the way, the Dangote refinery is in a free trade area in the Lekki part of Lagos. Let's get the closing thoughts of Dr. Muda Yusuf. Dr. Muda Yusuf, while we appreciate your contributions earlier, let's get your closing thoughts. We know, your chief concerns about boosting productivity and so on and so forth. But what is it that government needs to get right so that the numbers begin to look brighter, and then we have many more smiling faces in our streets and at home?
Yeah, thank you very much. In economics, there's what you call a general equilibrium approach to economic management. I think we need to have that framework in the management of our economy so that we know the implications of what is happening in one segment for the other segment and for the rest of the economy. And for that to happen, we need a framework that will coordinate all the activities and policy measures of all the key drivers of policy in this economy. We should put an end to this silos mentality, this territorial mindset of each MDAs and ministries and all of that in economic matters. I think we need a framework that will coordinate all of these things so that we don't try to solve one problem in one area and create a bigger problem in other areas. Secondly, when we are through with refurbishing or whatever of the refineries, as much as possible, the government should not be managing refineries. We are where we are today because the refineries are being managed by the government. The government can have part ownership. We can replicate the NLNG model that is working well. Let us replicate it in the refineries. I think that is what I would say. And the GDP numbers did not properly capture the maritime sector. So for the NBS, they need to look at their figures properly and the sectors. The maritime sector is a very important sector. It's not properly captured in the GDP data. That is important. That is something that is important for us to look at. So that is what I will say as my closing thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Muda Yusuf, Chief Executive Officer, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprises. He is also the former DG, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you so much for your input. And economic analyst, Yushal Aliu, thank you. You came in late, but your contribution has been well noted. Thank you. Dr. Tochukwu Okafo, an economic analyst with specialization on inflation and the economy. He's also a senior economic analyst with Business Day Media Limited. Thank you for your input.
Okay.
And Professor Uche Owaleke, he's a professor of capital market, Nasarawa State University. Thank you so much for your input.
Thank you, Jumai.
Well, let's take foreign news now.